For Daniel Harper, life had already narrowed into something small and fragile long before his son disappeared. At 35, Daniel was a single father living in a modest two-bedroom apartment on the edge of a quiet suburban town. The paint on the walls was fading, the carpets permanently worn thin in the hallway where small feet had once raced back and forth. There was no wife waiting at home, no partner to split responsibilities with. The divorce had happened years earlier, quiet, final, and exhausting. Since then, Daniel's world had revolved around one person. His 9-year-old son, Liam. Liam was the kind of child who still believed the world was mostly good. He loved dinosaurs, asked endless questions about how roads were made, and insisted on wearing the same green long-sleeve shirt even when it was clearly too warm outside. His blue backpack, scuffed and fraying at the straps, was almost always on his shoulders. Inside it were schoolbooks, a bent water bottle, and a small toy car Daniel had given him after a rough week at school. Every weekday followed the same rhythm. Daniel would wake up early, make breakfast, walk Liam to school when he could, or watch him disappear down the street when work made mornings rushed. The school was only a few blocks away. A straight route. Familiar streets. Houses filled with families who waved politely but rarely spoke beyond small talk. It was safe. Or at least it felt safe. The day Liam vanished began like any other. It was late afternoon, the sun still high but softening toward evening. Liam had been dismissed from school at the usual time. Teachers remembered seeing him leave the building with the other children, his green shirt unmistakable in a sea of neutral colors. A few classmates walked part of the way with him before turning off toward their own homes. After that, no one noticed anything unusual. When Daniel arrived home that evening, the apartment was quiet. Too quiet. Liam's shoes weren't by the door. Daniel checked the time. Maybe he'd stopped to play. Maybe a friend's house. Maybe he'd gotten distracted looking at something in a shop window like he sometimes did. But as the minutes stretched into an hour, the familiar weight of unease settled into Daniel's chest. Calls were made. Teachers. Parents. Neighbors. No one had seen Liam past a certain point. His phone, cheap and rarely used, went straight to voicemail. By nightfall, police cars lined the street. Search teams combed the neighborhood. Flashlights swept across backyards, alleys, and parks. Daniel walked alongside officers, calling his son's name until his voice cracked. He tried to picture Liam scared but safe, sitting somewhere waiting to be found. But hours passed. Then days. And Liam never came home. The investigation began aggressively. Officers retraced Liam's route from school. They interviewed classmates, teachers, shop owners, bus drivers. They reviewed traffic cameras, grainy footage that showed children walking, cars passing, shadows stretching across sidewalks. Nothing. No struggle. No witnesses. No screams. Liam had simply vanished between the school gates and his front door. Daniel's life collapsed into a blur of interviews, sleepless nights, and desperate hope. He hung flyers on every pole and storefront. He went on local news, his voice shaking as he begged anyone with information to come forward. His face aged rapidly, dark circles under his eyes, shoulders permanently hunched forward like he was bracing for impact. But weeks turned into months, and months into years. 2 years after Liam disappeared, the case was officially labeled cold. Police told Daniel they would never stop looking, but the patrols slowed. The calls stopped coming. The world moved on in a way Daniel never could. His apartment stayed exactly the same. Liam's room remained untouched. The bed made. The dinosaur posters still taped to the walls. The green long-sleeve shirt missing from the closet, because Liam had been wearing it the day he vanished. Daniel stopped dating entirely. He had no energy for explanations, no room in his life for anything beyond grief and routine. He worked, came home, and sat in silence more often than not. Until one sleepless night changed everything. It started with something painfully ordinary. Daniel couldn't sleep. The quiet of the apartment felt heavier than usual. He opened his laptop and began scrolling, news, old messages, anything to distract himself. At some point, without any clear intention, he opened Google Maps. At first, it was just habit. He searched his old neighborhood. Zoomed in. Zoomed out. Traced routes he knew by heart. The walk Liam used to take from school. The corner shop. The crosswalk where Daniel had once scolded him for running ahead. And then Daniel froze. There, on the screen, was an image captured by a passing Google Street View vehicle. Two figures stood on the sidewalk. One was an adult man, tall, wearing a brown suit that looked strangely formal for a residential street. His posture was stiff, his face partially blurred like all Street View images, but something about him felt out of place. The other figure was a child. Small, slender, wearing a green long-sleeve shirt. A blue backpack slung over his shoulders. Daniel's hands began to shake. The man in the image was holding the child's hand. Walking forward, mid-step, frozen in time. Daniel leaned closer to the screen, his heart pounding so hard he thought he might be sick. He zoomed in until the pixels blurred beyond recognition. But he didn't need clarity. He knew that shirt. He knew that backpack. He had bought it himself. The image timestamp showed it had been taken just days after Liam disappeared. On the exact route Liam would have walked home. Daniel stared at the screen for hours, barely breathing. His mind raced through possibilities. Was it Liam? Could it be someone else wearing the same colors? A coincidence. But the angle, the size, the timing, nothing felt random. He contacted police immediately. Officers examined the image carefully. They acknowledged the similarities. They agreed the child's clothing matched what Liam had been wearing the day he vanished. But the man. No license plates were visible. No identifying features. No reports of a man in a brown suit seen in the area. No fingerprints. No witnesses. The image raised more questions than answers. Who was he? Why was he holding Liam's hand? And how had no one noticed them at the time? Despite renewed interest, the lead went nowhere. The man in the brown suit was never identified. The image remained the only trace of Liam after that afternoon. A digital ghost, walking beside a stranger, frozen forever on a quiet street. For Daniel, the discovery reopened wounds he had barely learned to survive with. Hope returned, but it came sharp, cruel, and relentless. Because now, instead of imagining endless possibilities, he had a single haunting image burned into his mind. His son, alive, walking away, holding the hand of a man no one could name. And as Daniel would soon learn, that image wasn't the answer. It was the beginning of something far darker. When the police reopened Liam Harper's case, they didn't announce it publicly. There was no press conference. No renewed search parties flooding the streets. Instead, the investigation restarted quietly, almost cautiously, as if everyone involved was afraid of giving Daniel Harper hope they couldn't deliver. The Google Street View image became the center of everything. Detectives printed it out in high resolution and pinned it to a corkboard in the evidence room. They studied it from every angle, zooming in on the child's clothing, the man's posture, the direction of their movement. At first glance, it looked simple, almost ordinary. But the longer they stared, the stranger it became. The timestamp placed the image just 4 days after Liam vanished. That meant one of two things was true. Either Liam was still alive days after his disappearance, or the child in the image wasn't Liam at all. And both possibilities were disturbing. The officers began with what they could verify. Liam's outfit that day had been carefully documented. The green long-sleeve shirt, the blue backpack with a loose strap and a faded cartoon patch on the side. The Street View image showed a bag that appeared nearly identical, down to its shape and how it rested against the child's back. Daniel was asked to come in and look at the image again. This time, they didn't rush him. He sat in a small, sterile room while the photo was projected onto the wall. The child's face was blurred by Google's automatic privacy filter, but the rest of him was clear enough to hurt. Daniel didn't hesitate. "That's him," he said quietly. The detectives asked him why he was so sure. Daniel pointed out details no one else would notice. The way the backpack strap sat too high on one shoulder. The slight inward turn of the child's right foot when he walked. Even the way the green shirt bunched at the wrists, because it had been slightly too big when Daniel bought it. Every observation made the room heavier. If Daniel was right, then Liam hadn't been snatched violently. He hadn't screamed. He hadn't fought. He had been walking calmly beside someone, holding his hand. Investigators began reconstructing the exact route shown in the image. The Street View vehicle had been moving slowly that day, capturing images every few meters. They tracked where the child and the man appeared, and where they vanished from view. The image was taken on a narrow residential street that branched off from Liam's normal path home. A street he technically had no reason to be on. That detail mattered. Why would Liam deviate from his usual route? Unless someone had guided him. Or convinced him. Detectives canvassed the area again, knocking on doors they had already knocked on 2 years earlier. Most residents remembered nothing. A few vaguely recalled a Google car driving through the neighborhood, but no one remembered a man in a brown suit walking with a child. The brown suit itself became a point of obsession. It wasn't workwear. It wasn't casual. It stood out in a suburban neighborhood where most adults wore jeans or uniforms. Investigators wondered if it suggested something about the man's background. Was he trying to look respectable, authoritative, trustworthy? Psychologists consulted on the case suggested the clothing could have been intentional. A way to appear safe. A way to lower suspicion. Someone a child might not fear. The theory that emerged was chilling. What if Liam knew the man? Or at least believed he did? Daniel struggled with that idea. He replayed every memory of the months leading up to Liam's disappearance. Every conversation. Every adult who had crossed their lives. Teachers, tutors, neighbors, parents of classmates. But no one matched the image. No one wore brown suits. No one seemed out of place. Then came the questions no parent wants to ask themselves. Had someone been watching his son? Had someone learned his routine? Had someone noticed that Liam walked alone most days? Police examined similar missing child cases in surrounding areas. They searched for patterns. Children disappearing without a struggle, later linked to someone appearing authoritative or familiar. Nothing matched exactly. But something else caught their attention. The Street View image had anomalies. The man's face was blurred, but not in the same way as other pedestrians nearby in different images. The blur appeared heavier, almost distorted. The child's face was also blurred, but inconsistently. Some experts suggested it was just a technical glitch. Others weren't convinced. Frame-by-frame analysis showed slight inconsistencies in lighting around the figures, as if they didn't quite belong to the scene. Not enough to prove manipulation, but enough to unsettle the investigators who noticed it. There was another problem. The Street View vehicle should have captured more than one image of them. Yet only a single frame showed the man and the child together. In the next image down the road, they were gone. No turning away. No crossing the street. Just gone. Daniel latched onto that detail. People don't disappear between frames, he told detectives. But sometimes, answers hide in what's missing. Google was contacted directly. Requests were made for raw, uncompressed data from the vehicle that passed through that street on that day. The company cooperated, up to a point. They provided confirmation of the route, the time, and the equipment used. But there was no additional footage. No hidden angles. No extended capture. What existed publicly was all that existed. The image became both evidence and torment. Online forums eventually discovered it after a journalist quietly leaked its existence. Amateur sleuths pored over the photo, adjusting contrast, enhancing shadows, drawing outlines around the figures. Some claimed they saw the man's head slightly tilted toward the child, as if speaking to him. Others believed the man's grip on the child's hand looked tight. A few even suggested the image felt staged, too perfect, too centered, too clean. Daniel avoided the forums at first. But late at night, he couldn't help himself. He read theories until dawn, each one more disturbing than the last. Was the man a predator? A trafficker? Someone testing how easily a child could be taken? Or something else entirely? As public interest grew, so did scrutiny of Daniel himself. Some questioned how a child could vanish under his watch. Others whispered about negligence. A few darker voices online even suggested he might be involved, using the image as misdirection. Police found nothing to support those claims. Daniel's life had already been stripped bare by grief. Now it was being dissected by strangers. And still, the man in the brown suit remained unidentified. No one came forward. No tips led anywhere. No missing person reports matched him. It was as if he existed only in that single frame of time. But then, nearly 6 months after the image resurfaced, a private investigator working independently on the case noticed something no one else had connected before. A detail so small it had been overlooked entirely. Something in the background of the image. Something that suggested the moment captured on Google Maps might not have been the first time Liam had walked with that man. And possibly, not the last. The detail was almost invisible. That was the terrifying part. When the private investigator, an independent contractor named Marcus Reed, first noticed it, he didn't react immediately. He had been staring at the Google Street View image for hours, doing what thousands of others had already done. Zooming, adjusting contrast, isolating shapes in the background. But unlike online sleuths, Marcus wasn't chasing theories. He was looking for repetition. Patterns were what mattered in missing person cases. People rarely acted once. They repeated behaviors. They reused routes. They returned to places where they felt unnoticed. And that's when Marcus saw it. Behind the man in the brown suit, partially obscured by a parked car, was a small storefront window. The reflection in the glass was faint, distorted by glare, but still visible enough to catch a trained eye. In that reflection was a second adult figure. Standing still. Watching. Marcus printed the image and pinned it beside a map of the neighborhood. He enhanced the reflection carefully, cautious not to distort the original data. The figure wasn't clear enough to identify, but one thing stood out immediately. The posture. Upright. Rigid. Hands down by the sides. Not walking. Waiting. Marcus cross-referenced the storefront location with older street view captures, images taken months before Liam disappeared. And that's when the pattern emerged. In 2 earlier images, taken on different days, the same storefront appeared in the background. And in both images, a man stood nearby. Different clothing. Different angles. Same height. Same posture. Watching the sidewalk. Those earlier images didn't show Liam. But they showed something else. They showed the route. The realization hit Marcus like a physical blow. Someone hadn't just taken Liam. Someone had been observing him. The private investigator brought his findings to police, who initially dismissed the reflection as coincidence. Street reflections were unreliable. Human brains saw faces and shapes where none existed. But Marcus pushed harder. He overlaid the images, measured proportions, compared distances between shoulders, the length of arms, the spacing between feet. The similarities were uncomfortable. Enough that detectives reopened route analysis entirely. They charted Liam's movements for weeks prior to his disappearance. His schedule was predictable. School dismissal at the same time every day. Same walk. Same shortcuts. Daniel hadn't thought it was dangerous. He had thought it was independence. Investigators began re-interviewing teachers and staff, not about the day Liam disappeared, but about the weeks before it. That shift in focus changed everything. One teacher recalled something she hadn't mentioned before because it hadn't seemed important at the time. Liam had once mentioned a man who helps people cross the street. At the time, she'd assumed he meant a crossing guard. But there was no crossing guard assigned to that area. Another staff member remembered seeing Liam speaking to an unfamiliar adult near the school gates one afternoon. The man hadn't entered the school. He'd stood just beyond the fence, wearing a jacket, possibly brown. None of this had raised alarms then. It did now. Daniel was brought in again, this time to answer questions that cut far deeper than before. Had Liam ever mentioned strangers? Had he talked about someone giving directions, helping him, asking questions? At first, Daniel said no. Then he hesitated. There had been something. A comment made weeks before Liam vanished. Liam had mentioned a nice man who asked about dinosaurs. Daniel had smiled at the time, chalked it up to harmless conversation. Now the memory felt poisoned. The theory that formed was methodical and horrifying. Someone had identified Liam as vulnerable. A child who walked alone. A child with a single parent. A routine that never changed. The man in the brown suit wasn't improvising. He was executing. By the time the Google Street View image captured them together, trust may already have been established. That explained Liam's calm posture. The absence of struggle. The way he walked without resistance. The image wasn't a kidnapping in progress. It was the final step. Police attempted to trace other missing children whose disappearances overlapped geographically with the Street View vehicle's route. One case stood out. A boy, age 10, had gone missing 3 towns over the year before Liam vanished. His description was different, but the circumstances were disturbingly similar. Walked home alone. No witnesses. No struggle. No body. His case file mentioned a vague sighting of an adult male near the school days earlier, unidentified, well-dressed. Brown jacket. The connection was thin. But thin connections were all they had. Public interest intensified again when these details leaked. Online theories exploded. Some speculated about an organized offender using Google Maps unintentionally as documentation. Others believed the image was staged deliberately, meant to taunt or mislead. Daniel stopped reading comments entirely. He could barely function. The idea that his son had been watched, chosen, was unbearable. Then something happened that shifted the investigation from theory to fear. A forensic analyst reviewing the Street View metadata noticed a discrepancy. The image's timestamp did not align perfectly with the vehicle's logged GPS data. The difference was small, only a few seconds, but significant enough to suggest the system had paused. Street View vehicles don't pause randomly. They slow. They turn. But a pause meant something interrupted the capture sequence. Possibilities included a pedestrian crossing close to the vehicle, or someone stepping toward the camera. The implication was chilling. The man in the brown suit might have noticed the Street View car and adjusted. If that were true, then the image wasn't accidental. It was observed, possibly acknowledged, possibly ignored intentionally. Investigators began to consider a possibility that sent a ripple of unease through everyone involved. What if the man wanted to be seen? What if the image wasn't a mistake, but a message? Daniel was informed carefully. The detectives emphasized there was no proof, only questions. But questions were enough to shatter what little stability he had left. The idea that someone could walk openly with his son, in daylight, on a public street, unafraid of cameras, witnesses, or consequences, meant something far worse than a crime of opportunity. It suggested confidence, control, and experience. Then, just as the investigation reached this grim conclusion, a new tip came in. A woman from a neighboring city reported seeing a Google Maps image years earlier, one she had never been able to forget. It showed a man in formal clothing, walking with a child. And when detectives pulled the image she described, they saw the same posture, the same height, and a suit that looked disturbingly familiar. The second image changed everything. It wasn't public. It had never circulated online. The woman who reported it hadn't saved it, hadn't screenshotted it, and hadn't known at the time that it would matter. But she remembered it. She lived nearly 2 hours away from Daniel Harper's town, in a city dense with narrow streets and older buildings. Years earlier, while planning a move, she had been browsing her neighborhood on Google Maps, zooming in, clicking forward, idly watching familiar streets scroll past. And then she'd stopped. In one frame, she saw a man walking with a child. Nothing about it screamed danger. No struggle. No panic. Just an adult and a child moving together down the sidewalk. But something about the man unsettled her. He wore a suit. Not business casual. Not sloppy. Formal. Intentional. Brown. She remembered it clearly because it felt wrong for the setting. The image stayed with her for days before fading into the background of her memory, until she saw a news segment years later about a missing boy and a haunting Street View capture. That's when she realized she'd seen him before. Detectives located the image using Google's archival data. It took weeks of coordination, permissions, and technical verification, but eventually, the frame appeared on a monitor in a quiet evidence room. The similarities were undeniable. The man's height matched within centimeters. His posture was identical, upright, controlled, almost stiff. His stride had the same measured length. And the suit, though not identical, followed the same style. Brown. Structured. Conservative. The child beside him was different. Younger. Wearing different clothes. But walking the same way. Unresisting. Holding the man's hand. The distance between the two images, geographically and chronologically, suggested something investigators had been reluctant to say out loud. This wasn't a single crime. It was a pattern. The idea that the man had been unintentionally captured more than once by Google Street View raised disturbing questions. Street View cars followed fixed routes. If someone appeared repeatedly along those routes with different children, it suggested familiarity with routine, with timing, with invisibility. Investigators reviewed missing child cases across a wider region now. Patterns emerged, not enough for certainty, but enough for fear. Children disappearing on foot. No signs of force. No witnesses who saw anything overtly wrong. And always, a sense that the child had gone willingly. The man in the brown suit had not been reckless. He had been careful. He approached children in daylight, in public, in places where danger wasn't expected. He blended in by doing something that looked harmless, walking, holding a hand. Something parents did every day. Daniel was shown the second image in private. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He stared at the screen until the edges of the room seemed to blur. The realization that Liam might not have been the first was unbearable, but the implication that others might have followed was worse. For years, Daniel had lived inside a question. Where is my son? Now another question eclipsed it. Who took him, and how many times had they done this before? The investigation reached its limits quietly. No fingerprints. No DNA. No witnesses willing to come forward. The man in the brown suit remained faceless, untraceable, preserved only in fragments of digital time. Google Street View updated. The old images faded deeper into archives. Neighborhoods changed. Buildings were renovated. Storefronts closed. But the images remained. Frozen. Daniel moved away eventually. Not far, but enough that the streets stopped haunting him daily. He took Liam's belongings with him, the backpack, recovered from school, still holding the smell of old books and plastic. He kept the green shirt folded in a box. Not as evidence. As proof. Every year on the anniversary of Liam's disappearance, Daniel opened Google Maps. He followed the same route. He stopped at the same frame. The image never changed. A man in a brown suit. A child in green. Walking forward. Away from everything. The case was never solved. Officially, Liam Harper remains missing. But among investigators, among those who have seen the images and studied the patterns, there is a quieter understanding. Some crimes don't end in violence caught on camera. Some end in normalcy, in silence, in a child walking calmly beside someone they trusted, while the world kept moving around them. And somewhere, perhaps even now, a man in a brown suit may still be walking, unnoticed, unchallenged, holding a child's hand, and disappearing just beyond the edge of the frame.